Hi, this is Eternal King here, bringing you another LOR video today. So I wanted to talk about the top 10 standard players' mistakes that I see in Eternal. Stuff that I come across constantly, and this is even like Masters level players in Standard going into Eternal, and essentially being about as threatening as a silver level player that I would face on Eternal Ladder regularly. And in fact, probably less threatening because at least a silver level player, I won't really know what they're doing or what they're playing. Typically, standard play patterns are very identifiable. So first thing is pretty straightforward, and it is big is better. Biggest thing I see with standard players, and because again, in standard, big is better. That is just flat out correct. Bigger cards and decks that go bigger are in fact better than decks that do not go bigger. When I was talking about doing standard evaluations, Warden of the Tribes is currently one of the best cards in standard. It says, when I'm summoned, grant allies 1+1 for each different subtype you've summoned this game. So it provides you an overwhelmed body, and then it makes your units bigger. This is currently one of the best cards in standard. It's just, again, it's still shocking to me, but it's actually factually accurate. People are reporting 90% win rates with this card. It doesn't, there's no like ramp in the established shell. There's no getting to Warden of the Tribes faster. It's just I play a 9-mana play, and then my units are bigger than your units, and by Hearthstone rules, that means that I win. That's not how Eternal works. So I see a lot of people kind of carrying over that mentality from standard to Eternal, and it's very, very obvious. So that's like rule number one: is big is better. Big is not always better. There are a million reasons why big is not better. For example, we just have access to things like Disintegrate, right? So I spend 1 mana to Pie Toss your 9-mana Warden of the Tribes, and I spend 2 mana for the Disintegrate, and then 1 mana for the Pie Toss. So you spend 9 mana to make the biggest creature possible. I spend 3 mana to kill the biggest creature possible. It's kind of just an example of, like, in Eternal, big is not better. Big decks are good as an archetype, but they are just one archetype in a sea of archetypes in Eternal, and they're not necessarily better. I'll give you an example of one of the best decks in Eternal, and was one of the best decks in the game when it was, standard viable, and that is Azir Aurelia. Nothing about Azir Aurelia is big, right? So you create, again, I saw a standard player trying to play this just recently. I think his name was like Crazy Dave or something, and it was clearly the first time he'd ever touched the deck, so I'm not going to give him a hard time or anything, but, he basically tried to recall and return Ribbon Dancer, and then he just got the vanilla 2/1 with no Blade Dance, and he also didn't have any of his strong synergy points on board to make Blade Dance do anything. And he just immediately conceded because he's just like, I don't understand what this deck is doing, and I don't understand why it's a good deck. Eternal's weird. Eternal is weird for any standard player where the cards are not big. None of the, you can build a deck around having things be small and have it be one of the best decks in the game. For example, the way that this deck actually wins is it's a turbo level up deck. It's a combo deck. It's a combo rally based deck where you have Azir fully level up, and then when he's leveled up, he makes your token stronger. And then Aurelia, when she's fully leveled up, what she does is she basically uses a swap effect for 0 mana to replace the little tokens with her big quick attack body at burst speed. And you can use that to either go for lethal, or you can use that to ensure proper board trades. Not trades, but you have quick attack, so you're not trading. You're just eating their unit. So what happens is that in the Azir Aurelia deck, you have to level up Azir to make your tokens bigger, and then you have to level up Aurelia to give you that sort of open board swing flexibility and burst speed movement on board. And then obviously the rest of the deck is just designed to make your tokens go bigger. So instead, Emperor's Army being the new card, I'm not going to talk about the new cards, but again, just basic, like, standard tutorial 101 stuff. You're coming from standard, you think that biggest cards are best, and it's basically universally true across the board. Some of the best decks in Eternal focus entirely on attacking with small things, and they are in fact some of the best decks in the game. This one in particular is actually one of the most hated decks in the history of LOR, because it plays in a very strange fashion. So that's the first. So big is better is the first thing, and that the first mistake I see people make from standard to Eternal. And then the second mistake I would say is that leveling champs doesn't matter. A lot of the way that, you know, for example, if I was to build a deck with Eddie and Morgana, typically speaking, in the case of both the Eddie, you know, Eddie doesn't really get leveled. I've never seen Eddie level in the course of the card being released in my entire time of seeing the card played. Eddie has never leveled. In the standard brews, Morgana might level, but again, it's almost a byproduct of just playing her out on curve normally and getting her play effect. But so, you know, first mistake is big things are best. Second mistake is, you know, basically leveling champions doesn't matter. Leveling champions is huge. I'll give you an example of one of my favorite control decks in the game, which again, control doesn't exist in standard, but it's actually a big archetype in Eternal. Meta Jace Lux, right? So we talked about Azir Aurelia where leveling champs matters. Meta Jace Lux, this entire deck basically does nothing unless you're leveling Jace and Lux. And the entire point is that it is a 6 mana cost spell synergy deck where every time you play 6 mana spells, you level your Lux and you level your Jace, and that has interesting effects that occur in the game thanks to leveling these champions. And if you don't successfully level these champions and keep them alive, the deck doesn't really do anything. But it's actually one of the best control decks in the game. So leveling champs matters. Big is not always better. 2 big mistakes there. 3, open attack, open attack, open attack. This is the biggest hallmark of a standard player I can ever see. And it's not always the right call for every single deck. I'll give you an example. So I like to play Poro King. He's kind of the mascot of the channel. And I recently was showing Lux Illuminated Poro King because Lux Illuminated was the new card. And I actually think she's very good in this deck specifically. Like no copium. In the Poro King deck, it is generally not very good to open attack with a 1/1, right? So Poro King, the way that it plays is actually you're developing every turn, right? You're developing more Poros, more Poros, more Poros. And then once you've developed a sufficient number of Poros, then you're playing slow speed Inspiring Light, you're playing burst speed Poro Snacks, and then the open swing is okay if you have burst speed Poro Snacks. But even then, slow speed Inspiring Light, developing the Lux, you know, the one-off of Light of Demacia, the Aberrant Mage Seeker, rolling out the Poro King and slow rolling Poro King. Everything about Poro King as a deck archetype does not function well if you just follow the standard philosophy of open attacking is always better. I would argue that in a Poro King, developing is always better. You never open attack with a Poro King deck. You just want to make your Poros as big as possible, and you want to level up Poro King and Lux Illuminated as fast as possible. That's all that matters in a Poro King deck. Open swinging for 1 damage is pointless. So that's the other thing, is so basically open swing, open swing, open swing. Unless you're playing literally one of the top aggro decks in the game, something like Annie Jhin. If you're playing, you know, Annie Jhin, open attacking is usually pretty good. But even then, if you have the 3 1-drop opening hand, usually you develop all 3 1-drops on turn 2 and then you swing. But again, for the most part, it's a lot of open attacking if you're an aggro deck because you're trying to get the opponent's life total down to a point where you can finish them off with a decimate. And so like that is, the open attacks are part of your win condition. They're not just a general rule for every single deck and archetype in LOR history. They are only good as for aggro decks. So again, if you're a standard player transitioning to Eternal, play aggro. Aggro is going to feel right at home for you in terms of what you're used to. Play aggro, absolutely. But, you know, tackling a combo deck like Azir Aurelia, if you're like brand new to the extended card pool format and you've never touched the deck before, it's going to be like a nightmare for you. It's just, it's actually kind of complicated in terms of the optimal ways to play the deck. The other thing is that alt win cons are bad. So the other assumption, just recently I was trying to repopularize Rise, tweak Rise for the new season. The big assumption is that alt win cons are bad. Alt win cons aren't terrible in Eternal. They're not and in some cases they're amazing. I talked about Bandle Tree a lot. Bandle Tree is like one of the highest win rate decks in Eternal, and it's entirely based around OTKing the opponent with a landmark. So like that's an alt win con that's amazing. Rise is on the weaker end of the spectrum, but that's another case of an OTK landmark based deck that I think is not bad. It's got its matchups, right? It's got its games where it can win. It's fun more importantly than anything else. But obviously, if I was like tryharding, Bandle Tree is the better OTK alt win con. Alt win cons are alternate win cons, ways of winning the game indirectly. So things like Fiora, things like Bandle Tree, things like Rise, and then Star Springs. So there's a lot of alternate win cons in LOR, and none of them are viable in Standard at all. And then in Eternal, some of them are really good, and some of them are just playable, and that's kind of the range. And some are more fun than others. But so that's the other kind of standard assumption that is wrong. Alternate win cons are bad. So that's 4. Chances are I'm only going to have time for one more in this video. I think I'm going to focus on. This is a very good question. We talk a lot about stories, right? So like landmark value based decks. I think that's a pretty good example of a case where, again, standard players would not assume that a value-based landmark would be one of the best cards in the game. But Sunken Temple, when it's used in combination with cards like Twisted Fate, is quite simply one of the most powerful cards in the game. Period, full stop. And you don't even necessarily need to run Sunken Temple in TF specifically. It's just a good control card overall. So again, landmarks are good. Value-based landmarks are good. And in fact, they can go into something like a 60% win rate deck that you will just simply not see in Standard ever. You would, a lot of Standard players might look at and not be aware of the power that is, TF Sunken Temple, unless you've specifically seen the deck in action. And we might have room for one more little factoid as well, and just kind of common mistakes from Standard players versus Eternal players. There's a lot more healing available in the format, so like life as a resource is kind of a big deal in Eternal specifically. You could think of things like Tavern Keeper, right? There we go. Tavern Keeper, right? So a lot of healing that was available in LOR got rotated out. So cards like Kindly Tavern Keeper, just a vanilla 3/3 that heals your Nexus for 3. Obviously not as good as an Explore card, because an Explore card can remove landmarks, but presumably if your only thing that you care about is providing an anti-aggro solution, Tavern Keeper is superior to an Explore card. If that's the only thing that you're trying to do, Tavern Keeper's the better card, flat out. And again, that's just one example, but there's tons of healing that was rotated out of the format, and obviously that helps play into the idea that control is better in Eternal, is that you have access to healing, you have access to cheap removal, you have access to, again, just a lot of alternate win cons, you have access to a lot of value landmarks, you have access to a lot of high synergy champions and concepts. And so all of these things kind of add up to the fact that, like, if you were to break down everything that I discussed point by point, it almost sounds like Eternal is a different game than Standard, and that any Standard player that comes over to Eternal is kind of bad. It's honestly kind of true. Again, I'm bad at Standard flat out because I don't think it's terribly interesting to essentially figure out whose units are bigger. That there's not much in terms of what I like about the game in that equation. So that's because I'm bad at Standard. And then you take a player like Sunny, who has been Masters ranked in every single Standard season of LOR ever, and then you plop him in Eternal, and he gets like hard stuck diamond. And you know, because he just doesn't understand how to build decks that are high synergy concepts, right? And would rather just kind of complain about the format and call it a joke. It's like, no, it's not a joke. I would argue that Eternal is probably more balanced than Standard, but it takes some getting used to. That's for sure. So hopefully you found this kind of tips guide on top mistakes standard players make in Eternal. But it is very, very obvious. And if it sounds like it's a bit of a elongated discussion, at the end of the day, do keep in mind, do not bounce your blade. Yeah, don't bounce and summon your blade dance cards, right? If you don't want people to think that you've never stepped foot in Eternal before and have no concept of how the format is played, don't like bounce your ribbon dancer and then resummon it and not get a blade dance off of it. It's pretty brutal. Or don't like watch your opponent develop 2 healing units and then auto concede because they develop 2 healing units. Again, so many healing units available in Eternal. In Ionia, you have access. Obviously, Cosmic Youngling, I believe, is standard legal. It is one of the best healing cards in the game. But then Ionia also has access to things like Dragonlings. Dragon on 2 mana. Eye of the Dragon, obviously being one of the best healing cards in the game as well. And not currently standard legal. So again, look at all that. If we just do a search for like healing based cards, they're all gone. So there's no control in standard. There's no combos. There's just who's the biggest mid-range deck. Period. Full stop. And there's probably some aggro mixed in there as well. But it does mean that when you get to Eternal, keep in mind that, you know, open swinging for 4 damage or 3 damage doesn't really matter if the opponent's just going to heal for 3 damage. It's much better to develop, work towards your win con or your synergy, and go off, so to speak, than it is to then just push that 3 damage and not do anything. Because at that point, you're basically just auto-conceding. This is Eternal King, signing out.